We're floating in the sky here. We're at the top of Shibuya Sky, a skyscraper and observatory in the center of Tokyo. And everywhere around us, 360 degrees on this observation deck, is Tokyo. And it's Tokyo as far as the eye can see, because Tokyo is the world's largest urban area. It's the world's largest metropolitan area. Nearly 40 million people. It's extraordinary. Of course, this is the capital city of one of the leading economies of the world, the capital not only politically, but commercially, financially. This is the center of action, and the scale of Tokyo is extraordinary. There's been extraordinary growth of this city over the last 75 years. From the middle of the 20th century, Tokyo was around 10 million people in 1950. Now it's nearly 40 million people, so roughly 4 times growth. And that remarkable demographic change, that population dynamics, is a reflection of several fundamental changes in not only Tokyo and Japan, but in the world, that really is very important for us to understand. What do we know? We know that the world population as a whole is increasing markedly. The world population in the middle of the 20th century in 1950 was around 2.5 billion people. Today it is just over 8 billion people. It's been more than a 3-time rise of the world population since the middle of the 20th century. We know that the world is becoming more urbanized. That means that the proportion of humanity living in cities like this one, although nothing's quite like this one, living in cities has also increased and will continue to increase markedly. In 1950, the share of the world population living in cities was around 1/3. Actually, if we go back to the beginning of the 1800s, it was around 1/10. Today, it's more than half of the world population living in cities, around 55% worldwide. So the share of the population living in cities has increased tremendously. And in Japan, even more remarkably, because in Japan in 1950, around 1/3 of the population was living in cities, and today it's over 90%, almost an entirely urban country. So this is a second major fact. Rising world population, rising share of the population in cities. A third fact, epitomized and led by Tokyo, is that since Asia is home to 60% of the world population, and since Asia has urbanized rapidly with a dramatic rise of the share of population in Asia entering cities during the last 75 years, since the middle of the 20th century, it is Asia's cities, like Tokyo is number one, but Asia's cities more generally, that are now the world's largest urban agglomerations. And a fourth point of demography that is essential to understand is that as these trends have taken place, and in part to understand these trends, there has been a fundamental change in world trade patterns that support this demographic change to large urban areas. And that is places like Japan, other high urban population centers of Asia have become major food importing regions. In the pre-industrial world, by and large, populations were fed from their own agricultural hinterlands. The cities were fed by the agricultural regions around them. Now, cities like Tokyo are fed from farms that are halfway around the world, from the great farms of Brazil or Argentina or Canada or the United States or Russia or Ukraine or Australia. The great breadbasket regions of the world provide the grains that enable the people of Tokyo to have their daily bread and to have their daily rice and to be able to live with the high and decent nutrition. So the fourth demographic change is about the division of labor in the world. Who produces what? Who produces manufactured goods? Who produces and where is produced the food commodities? And how are those traded in international markets that lead to agglomerations of 40 million people? So these are the basic facts for us to reflect upon as we reflect upon this world's largest urban center. Let's therefore step back to 1950. The world was really quite different. The cities were smaller, although there were some giant cities. But the big cities of 1950 are quite different from the list of the largest cities in the world today. In 1950, the world's largest city was New York City, with a population of around 10 million people. New York City, my city, doesn't even make the top 10 of the world in 2023. The world has changed so much that the United States doesn't have one country in the top 10. There were two in 1950, the United States and Chicago. They're both much farther down on the list. New York was the largest urban agglomeration. Now it ranks 11th. Chicago, much farther down on the list. In 1950, there were 4 cities in Asia that were in the top 10. Tokyo was one of them. Osaka was another, so Japan had 2. There was 1 in China, Shanghai, and there was 1 in India, Calcutta. Now in 2023, as I observe Tokyo from Shibuya Sky, there are 7 of the top 10 urban agglomerations now in Asia. 2 are in Japan, again, Tokyo and Osaka. 2 are in China, Beijing and Shanghai. 2 are in India. Calcutta is not in the top 10 any longer, but Delhi and Mumbai are 2 of the largest 10 cities in the world. And 1 is in Bangladesh, Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. So 7 of the top 10. And the top 10 in the current day is rounded off by 2 in Latin America, Sao Paulo and Mexico City, and 1 in Africa, Cairo. So we have the 10 largest cities in the world today. Not one of them is in the United States or, notice, in Europe. This is rather extraordinary. This is the change of the world today. In 1950, the United States had 2, as I mentioned, New York and Chicago. Europe had 3 of the largest 10 cities in the world: London, Paris, and Moscow. They don't make the list now. So we have a world that has become much larger in urban scale, because the largest city in 1950, New York, was around 10 million people, and now the largest city in the world today is 40 million, where we are in Tokyo, but also a world that is remarkably and increasingly dominated by Asian mega cities. And that trend is going to continue for a while because Asia's largest cities are really going to be the giants of the world. The Western world, and by that I mean North America and Western Europe, which was the first to industrialize and had the biggest cities in the world because of the new industrial economies of the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, don't show up at the top of the list. And this is another sign of how Asia is becoming once again really the center of gravity of the world economy. Now, later in this century, no doubt, many of the world's largest cities will be in Africa, because Africa is now the part of the world with the fastest rate of population growth. Africa today is 1.4 billion people, the same size as India and China, but Africa is also, of course, divided into 55 separate sovereign countries. It's not one nation, but Africa is also urbanizing very, very rapidly now. So it's projected that in the next 20 years or so, certainly there will be more African cities in the largest urban agglomerations in the world. Now, what made for this transformation that is taking place? What made for, first, the overall rise of world population? Second, what made for the overall rise of urbanization? Third, what made for the dramatic increase in the presence of Asia among the world's mega cities? And fourth, how has all of this reshaped the global division of labor? Well, we know that at the core, the Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century with the steam engine, and then with the application of the steam engine to transport and rail and ocean steamers, was by itself a fundamental cause of a massive rise of overall world population, because in the industrial age it was possible to produce more food for more people. Now, food could be produced in more distant regions because regions of high potential agricultural productivity could be opened up with the food brought by rail or brought by ocean steamers. So more regions could be opened up. Fertilizer could now be transported long distances, and this meant rising productivity per hectare in the amount of food that was produced. Where food was produced with different crops became much more flexible in the industrial age, in an age of rapid transportation. So the first fundamental point is population rose in the 19th century from around 1 billion people in 1800, roughly speaking, to around 2 billion people by the beginning of the 20th century, that is 1901, to around 8 billion people today, nearly a 10-time rise of population during the industrial age until today, because of a massive increase of the capacity to grow food. Now, why in that overall rise of population was there a sharp rise of the share of the population living in urban areas? Again, if we go back to 1800, at the beginning of the industrial era, perhaps 10% of the world population lived in cities and 90% lived on the farm in rural areas. And the reason that 10% became today's 55% and will be 70% of the world population living in urban areas by mid-century is most importantly because productivity of farmers has soared in the industrial age. Each farmer can now support not only the own farm family, which was the case back in 1800, but can support 20 families, 50 families, another 99 families. In the United States, 1% of the workforce produces the food for all 100% of the population. So the farm population is just 1% of the total employment in the United States. And that's because of the remarkable rise of productivity per farmer, because of the industrial age, the scientific age, the improvement of crops, the improvement of fertilizers, and knowledge of how to use them and how to produce them inexpensively. And that has meant that a smaller and smaller share of the world is devoted to food production and is therefore engaged in manufactures or services or other industrial activities, but not in agriculture. And it turns out the best place to be in services, in retail trade or in entertainment or in finance, is in crowded face-to-face places, that is in cities. And so when agriculture declines as a proportion of employment, urbanization rises because people go for where their jobs are going to be productive. And so the rise of productivity of agricultural production is a fundamental reason that enables more urbanization to take place. So we have two facts: rising populations, rising share of the populations in urban areas. Why have Asia's cities in particular burst onto the scene, whereas the large cities we know from history in Europe and then later in the United States now not even showing up in the top 10 list in the world? And that's fundamentally because Asia has been and continues to be home to the majority of the world's population. But until the middle of the 20th century onward, most of Asia was still not industrial economy. Most of Asia was still a pre-industrial economy, still largely agricultural. And so Asia's cities had not really formed yet because Asia was still in a pre-industrial economic structure, with most of the Asia population living in villages and producing food outputs at quite low productivity. It's after World War II in particular, though in Japan it came already at the beginning of the 20th century, that industrialization enabled the shift of Asia's population to urban areas. So there was a kind of delayed reaction. Urbanization came in Europe and in the United States in the 19th century, and it came to most of Asia in the second half of the 20th century. Industrialization, rising agricultural productivity, and populations thereby shifting to urban areas and enabling this remarkable scale of urban life that we see all around us at Shibuya Sky. But there's one more factor that is crucial. Of course, in Japan, agricultural productivity, output per farmer rose with mechanization, with better rice varieties, with more intensive use of fertilizers and other methods for raising agricultural production. But that's not the whole story, because when I speak about the rise of agricultural productivity that enables urbanization, it's not necessarily occurring within each country by itself so that Japan's urban population is fed by Japan's farmers alone. What has happened in the second half of the 20th century in particular, and continues until today, is that we have a division of labor in the world which reflects fundamental patterns of geography. Asia is densely populated. There's relatively little land per person. You can see 40 million people in this area. There isn't too much farmland around. There's basically none, I would say. And this is true throughout most of Asia. High populations in relatively low or smaller land areas. In other words, high population densities, population measured per hectare or per kilometer squared. Whereas in other parts of the world, because of history, the population to land area is much, much lower. And in many places, the population to arable land area is much lower. Arable meaning land that can be used productively for agriculture. So we wouldn't expect a lot of people in desert regions, but there are regions of great farmland where the population densities are relatively low. And those include the United States, they include Canada, Australia, Russia, Ukraine, Brazil, Argentina, and some other countries as well. But those giants that I mentioned are places where there are vast agricultural regions and relatively lower populations. And usually history is important to explain those differences. For example, in the Americas, the low population to arable land ratio can be explained by geography and by history. When the land route from Asia to the Americas was submerged with the melting of the great glaciers at the end of the Pleistocene, at the beginning of our era, the Holocene, and the Americas were cut off from a land bridge to Asia, the populations in the Americas was relatively small. And because technologies did not move from the old world to the Americas, those populations remained relatively limited in size in the Americas. When the connection between Europe and the Americas came with the voyages of Columbus and the subsequent voyages of the Europeans to the Americas, the population of the Americas was decimated by disease. So there was a collapse of population with the so-called Columbian Exchange, which got wonderful crops from the Americas for the rest of the world, like the potato, but also brought old world diseases, pathogens, to the new world, like smallpox, which created horrific epidemics in the New World and reduced the population by 90 or even 95% of the indigenous populations of the Americas. This means that historically, the Americas have been low population, and that means that they have a very low population to arable land ratio, or to take the inverse, a great deal of farmland per person. Natural food exporters, whereas Asia, with a very low amount of land per population, is natural food importers. One can add dimensions more than land to this. There's plentiful water in Brazil or in Argentina, whereas in China, water is a terrible problem in northern China. So the export of grains, soybeans from, or grains or soybeans from Brazil to China is what we call a kind of hidden export of water itself, not just of land area, but of water, because it's the water that enables the high crop yields in Brazil, and that enables the feeding of China through Brazil's agricultural production. Now, if you're importing food in Asia, you have to pay for it somehow. That's the great trick of Asia's economic development of the last 100 years. This region, without much farmland, also has very few other natural resources. There's no oil around except that which is coming in oil tankers. This country is largely without the primary energy sources, the fossil fuel sources that fueled industrialization. It's without the great agricultural regions. So how did it become one of the richest and largest economies of the world? Well, the answer is it went down the vocation of industrialization, and especially of manufactured goods. And because of manufacturing in Japan, and very sophisticated manufacturing and very efficient manufacturing, Japan was able to become an industrial power even without the primary resources, even without the food production, even without the agricultural production within Japan, even without the energy resources within Japan, and yet still a great industrial power. And this is what international trade enabled. International trade meant that Japan could sell its industrial goods and import food and raw materials for industry at the same time. And this was a win-win proposition because regions that were natural food producers received Japanese products, could import Toyotas and Sony microelectronics, and the food production or soybean production in Brazil, or grain production and beef production in Argentina could feed the population here. And that global division of labor is core, of course, to how our world works today. Any idea that we could support 8 billion people without a global economy is completely a misconceived idea, a terrible misunderstanding. Asia is well fed because it exports goods and services in industry and throughout the service sector in order to be able to import the food grains and the feed grains that keep the population fed. This is core to globalization. And if we somehow were to fail disastrously to support and promote an interconnected world, we would also have a world of calamity where there would be hunger and strife quite quickly, because the world that we have today, and a world that can be prosperous for all if we pay attention to it, is a world based on a division of labor that is essential to global well-being. So when we enjoy Shibuya Sky, when we marvel at being an observatory overlooking the world's largest urban agglomeration, what we're also seeing is a great deal of recent history, demographic change, urbanization, the fruits of the industrial and now the digital era, and all of it made possible by the interconnectedness of a globalized economy. We should remember that lesson because we need to protect and support that division of labor in the 21st century.